There's a scene in Nimona where Ballister asks Nimona a question.
What are you?
And Nimona simply responds,
I'm Nimona.
It's one of the simplest exchanges in the film, and yet the 5-word question and response summarises the message of the story. Despite everything, how Nimona looks, feels, speaks, walks, she is Nimona. No matter how she's tied down through preconceptions, she is who she is. The question itself isn't really asking who she is. Ballister is after an answer where he can neatly categorise her into something he understands. A scenario many in the queer community, especially those who are trans and or gender non-conforming, have likely experienced. It's often asked due to confusion or the discomfort that can emerge when someone struggles to understand identities outside of their own experiences or knowledge. Existing outside of the status quo or fully rejecting it, much like Nimona, ties into the deeply personal nature of N.D. Stevenson's creative expression.
Nimona was like a character that just started like popping up in the pages of my sketchbook, and it was just like the character that I needed at that time. And she was also just like really assured of herself in a way that I just like wasn't at that time. And so
not just because Nimona is gender fluid or because the film contains openly gay characters, but because the entire story revolves around the fear of being seen incorrectly. The fear that people will look at one part of you and decide that part is all you are before you ever get the chance to define yourself. Both Nimona and Ballister are ostracised and belittled for different reasons that ultimately stem from the same thing: prejudice. Ballister is judged for becoming a knight through the Queen's support despite being a commoner.
I know I've always been tough on you, and I never thought you belonged here. And?
Meanwhile, Nimona's shapeshifting ability is feared by everyone as something dangerous and deceitful.
Stop! She's my friend!
she's a monster.
Both examples show classism and gender expression being at the forefront of people's fear and intolerance. These lines feel familiar because they echo real-world scenarios used against minorities continuously, where, even if you are tolerated, it's only conditional before something goes wrong. Take Bukayo Saka, for example. After England's loss in the Euros 2020 final, he and other black players were subjected to a wave of racist abuse after missing penalties. Despite being supported throughout the entire tournament, that support quickly disappeared the moment they were seen as having failed. So coming back around to Nimona, where Ballister is framed for murder, that same conditional support immediately collapses. Instead, people retract back to their original preconceived notion of him being suspicious and unworthy. He was never truly accepted in the first place, because society had already decided what he was long before he was given the chance to define himself, much like Nimona.
They only see you one way, no matter how hard you try.
Once someone reduces someone to a singular aspect of their identity, that perception often begins to overshadow everything else about them, especially if they've done something wrong or, shock horror, being outspoken. Instead of critiquing people with the nuance afforded to any other human being, their identity becomes the primary attribute of which they're labelled and shamed, especially in news articles or tabloids, because they know homophobes, transphobes and racists will eat up any opportunity to add more reason to hate on minorities. And that's why the story of Nimona is more than just a queer movie. Well, I mean it is. There's many queer people involved throughout the entire creative process, and it's a film I'd recommend anyone watch, especially younger audiences. But ideally what I'm trying to say is that Nimona shows how society fixates on certain aspects of a minority's identity and allows it to dominate how they are perceived. And interestingly, that core idea remains consistent even across the story's two radically different interpretations. As the original webcomic and graphic novel version of Nimona feels radically different from the film adaptation. Like, very different. Many themes stay true through translation, but the emotional storytelling and moral ambiguity within the original story is far darker and less family-friendly than what ultimately made it into the film. The comic places more responsibility on the audience to reconcile Nimona's contradictions themselves, while the film more actively guides the viewer towards compassion and understanding. To put it in the simplest terms, the comic is unapologetically messy and isn't looking to make things appear unproblematic, while the film smooths some of that messiness into something more hopeful, accessible, and ultimately more palatable within a mainstream Hollywood framework. Rather than treating one as superior to the other, it makes sense to view them as two separate journeys, where the finish lines are kind of in the same general place. Before Nimona became one of the most openly queer animated films to emerge from a major Western studio pipeline, a broken pipeline that had to be fixed with repair tape, it began life as a webcomic, a personal project of teenage N.D. Stevenson's.
Nimona was really just like this weird little idea that I didn't know what I was going to do with it, and it started out as just a doodle posted on Tumblr.
That's why the comic isn't so cookie cutter or made with the intention of making everything neat and digestible. He wrote the webcomic and published it on Tumblr, not with a film adaptation in mind, or even with the sole intention of getting picked up by a publisher, but because it was a story he wanted to tell, pure and simple. That's why it worked and connected with thousands, because he was pouring so many feelings into a story. And in hindsight, Nimona almost became more meaningful to Stevenson himself, as he later recognised emotions within the comic he hadn't yet fully processed.
And as many 19-year-olds are, I was going through the transition of going from being a kid to being an adult and figuring out what that meant for me. So Nimona was a way of, she started popping up in my sketchbooks, and she was kind of this character that came about because she was everything I wanted to be.
Reading the comic now, it feels like Stevenson was unknowingly working through parts of himself in real time. Shapeshifters have always existed in fiction, and Stevenson himself has said that he loved Mystique from X-Men because of the appeal of a character unrestrained from a single form. So it makes sense that in Nimona, transformation becomes tied directly to identity. And given when the film adaptation was released, the motif of gender expression through shapeshifting felt especially timely. Since then, that reading has only become more relevant, not just in relation to Stevenson's own trans journey, but also as a reflection of the wider cultural climate surrounding trans identity and trans rights. The film reached mainstream audiences at a time where hostility towards trans people felt increasingly visible and politically charged, giving the story a level of representational weight beyond the original comic itself. Stevenson even said himself, "It would be irresponsible to present an ending without hope. Compared to the comic, which I think was hopeful in its own way, I think the movie takes a more aggressive stance with that radical hope and love and acceptance." Which is why I think the film pushes the idea of hope and empathy much further instead. That even if you don't fully understand someone, it's important that there's a willingness to listen and let that person feel seen. Even if Ballister or even the audience doesn't fully understand Nimona, the film argues that people still deserve compassion without needing to perfectly explain or justify who they are. That tonal difference also becomes visible in the story's approach to morality and violence. In the film, Nimona doesn't kill anyone, or at least from what we see. She probably palms people close to death, but in the comic it's far more direct that her moral compass isn't exactly goody two-shoes. You literally see her kill people and show very little remorse. Also, the entire sequence of Ballister losing his arm is entirely different in both stories. In the comic, Ambrosius purposely harms Ballister after losing out on a joust against him. His wounded ego is quite literally the reason Ballister becomes disabled, and it's hard to imagine that version of the scene being presented in the same light within a mainstream animated film. Which is probably why they changed it. In the film, it's more of a reactive response to seeing the Queen get hurt, and it's framed as a split-second mistake that Ambrosius instantly regrets and later apologises for. That's a completely different character compared to the comic. I mean, it makes sense, given Ambrosius was originally written as more of a archetypal white privileged golden boy hero in the comic, whilst the film reworks him into someone considerably more sympathetic and likeable. Even the way Ballister is introduced within the comic, already labelled a villain and seemingly unbothered by the title, is a far cry away from the film, where he hates being labelled as such.
Wait, are you saying that you're not a villain?
Yes!
Which is super interesting to me because while I do think some of those changes came from wanting a lighter tone and more sellable film, especially when trying to get a project through major studios, the movie is undeniably far more family-friendly than the comic. But I also think that highlights the way queer stories in Western media are often expected to present themselves as morally digestible, in order to be accepted as good representation. Like, would the story become any less queer depending on if Nimona was more openly murderous, or if Ambrosius is actually more of an asshole, or if Ballister doesn't hate being considered a villain? The only disclaimer I would add is that the film makes Ambrosius and Ballister's relationship visually explicit in a way the comic never fully does, as it's more subtexty there. But outside of that, it made me think back to an interview with Andy Stevenson that I remember reading years ago, where he asked, "Can you have a black Walter White or female Lex Luthor without making an uncomfortable political statement?" I think there's a lot of nuance in a question like that, but ultimately he's pretty much asking, can marginalised characters be allowed the full range of storytelling roles that any cis straight white characters or storytelling is allowed? Can they be messy, morally questionable, arrogant, selfish, or unlikable without their identity itself becoming the focal point of controversy? If a group lacks balanced representation and is instead repeatedly depicted through the same harmful stereotypes, like how many brown actors have historically been typecast almost exclusively as terrorists, then repeating those portrayals isn't really adding nuance, it's reinforcing an existing pattern. Meaning, when there's genuine range and diversity within a cast, individual characters are no longer treated as reflections of an entire community, but given different personalities and moral complexity that everyone else has. Ultimately, I think you can usually tell when an author's intentions aren't malicious. Stevenson doesn't write messy queer characters with the intention of portraying bad representation, but to portray a wide range of interesting people who aren't constrained to morally perfect good guys. And naturally, that tends to create far more interesting discussion around those characters. Well, sometimes anyways. Twitter and TikTok tore my beautiful cat lesbian apart, but that's a whole other topic. But in saying that, just because the intention comes from the right place doesn't always mean the impact will. That's why sensitivity readers or diverse writers' rooms are so important, especially when writing experiences outside of your own. Representation isn't just about numerical presence, but also about which characters the narrative chooses to emotionally invest in, or decide who does or doesn't evolve. That's not to say I hate the Nimona adaptation. In fact, comic lovers don't hold this against me, but I actually preferred it to the comic. But it's interesting, to say the least, to see how queer characters in this instance are seen as less desirable from a storytelling front when they're not good representation. I love Nimona, and I do genuinely appreciate the more hopeful tone the film included, especially within its ending. Ultimately, the heart of Nimona is about allowing people to feel truly seen, not an idolised version shaped to make other people comfortable, but the difficult and deeply human parts too. Or non-human for Nimona, I guess.
Can you please just be normal for a second?
Normal?
I just think it'd be easier if you were a girl.
Because truly seeing people also means accepting that no community can be reduced down into a single correct way to exist. So while positive representation absolutely matters, I also think there's value in stories that allow people to be messy without treating those qualities as a failure of representation itself, while still recognising how important historical stereotypes, framing and intent are within those portrayals. Maybe the answer isn't demanding perfect representation, but allowing more people to tell stories in the first place. And perhaps that's how you end up with a character like Nimona on the big screen at all. A shape-shifting, entirely unconcerned with gender character, but also impossible to box into a single label. Not because she represents everyone perfectly, but because she was never supposed to. Hey guys, thanks for watching to the end of the video. As always, I want to give a shout out to everyone on my YouTube memberships or on my Patreon for helping support the channel and allowing me to continue this channel and continue to make videos. I'm going to have a link in the description as to where you can buy the really nice hardcover Nimona edition of the comic, I should say. It is really, really nice and it has painted sprayed edges. Fully recommend. But I'm going to keep this one short and simple, so I just want to say a massive thank you to you guys for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next one.